Hey, what's going on, you guys? My name is The Raptor, and welcome back to Versus Matchup Review. A lot of you guys seem to like this kind of video. We've done it a few times already, so if you're new and interested in knowing how matchups get selected for this, I recommend checking out those other videos, or just read what's in the description. You'll find some other cool stuff there too. These are all just my opinions, but if you clicked on this video, it probably means you wanted to hear them, so proceeding with caution, let's go. So starting things off, we have Pete the Cat versus Bluto, Mickey Mouse versus Popeye. It goes without saying that there are so many cartoon matchups that exist right now, some with more recent characters and some with much older characters, and it's refreshing to see an idea with older cartoons where the characters are so clearly the most fitting for each other. Like, these are two of the most popular characters that fit into that big bully archetype, and I think that could lead to a fun personality and really cool analysis segments. You know, the connections are very simple. Again, it's more about the archetype itself than specific connections, but it's still effective in my opinion. The room for physical comedy is definitely undeniable, and for once, these characters are not taking on a pipsqueak compared to themselves. Like, that's one of the cool things about Death Battle, that with some of these characters, they're rarely ever fighting characters like themselves, but in a Death Battle, naturally, they would be in one way, shape, or form, and this definitely qualifies, and I think that can make it really interesting. Now, we know that Death Battle more so likes using the most iconic or the most topical cartoon characters in their matchups, which makes enough sense to me. There are some exceptions to that rule, but you know, that seems to be what they prioritize the most. And I have to be honest, if they were to ever get to doing this matchup, I think there would be a lot of other cartoon matchups that they would want to do first. That's just kind of the way it is. Although I will say that more Toon Force heavy villains would be nice. I think more villains in general would be nice, but this would be a good way of doing both of those things, you know, villains and Toon Force. But yeah, there are so many amazing cartoon ideas that this one will just never be one of my most wanted cartoon ideas. You know what I mean? The selection is honestly just so stacked as it is that it's harder for this one to stand out to me. But that's just me. Maybe you love it, and I do think that this is a perfectly fitting matchup. And a lot of the complaints or negatives I would have are more so just a matter of comparison. In a vacuum, I think this is a perfectly fine matchup, and if you like it, that's great. Next up, we have Sarge versus Soldier, Red versus Blue versus Team Fortress 2. This is one of those matchups that's been talked about for a very long time by a lot of people. It's one of the easiest ways to get TF2 back on the show, and one of the easiest ways to give RVB a quote normal episode, you know, not one that's just a same series fight. And it would be good to do both of those things, I think. I think it would be cool to look at the characters' capabilities and their inventories and see how they all work together. You know, the debate has been up in the air a little bit too, which is better than nothing. You know, I've always said that a hard debate is not always necessary, but it's still better to have one, or at least have a harder debate than have one that's painfully obvious. I think that always holds true. And it goes without saying that the banter potential and just the general personality makes for a matchup that's a lot of fun and a lot of hype in its own way. And I don't know if this is something people are thinking about, but I really don't think Rooster Teeth's shutdown is going to discourage Death Battle from making this episode. Ruby vs. Maka is happening sometime in the far future. We know that thanks to the Kickstarter. And yes, that was a promise to Monteoum, but even aside from that, we know the crew loves RVB, so even without them being tied to it in any way, shape, or form now, I still think it's an episode they would just want to do, and I can't see them ditching the whole boomstick dad stuff just like that either. Even if they only directly address it in one more episode, that being this one, I still think they would want to do it. But yeah, just in general, I think this matchup is easy to like because the series are easy to like, and that's a really good formula. Even if you don't know them that well, the episode could still be entertaining and fun, so I say bring it on. Moving on, Freddy Krueger versus Pennywise, A Nightmare on Elm Street versus It. These are two characters that would be so interesting for Death Battle to cover, but have had a lot of matchups over the years, and I think for a while had a lot of disagreements over who these characters should fight in particular. But I do believe we have now found the one matchup for both of these characters that works in every major way. You guys know that this matchup has been growing on me. I made a trailer for it semi-recently, and I've talked about it before. This one and Mysterio versus Scarecrow have become my most prominent Halloween matchups. And while I am more familiar with the characters of Mysterio and Scarecrow, and might be a little more excited for that one, this is still perfect for the horror side of Halloween matchups. Definitely a step up from Jason versus Michael in terms of abilities, and hopefully quality as well. Based on what Death Battle has been able to pull off before, I like to think that with the proper resources allocated to this episode, it could really live up to its potential. And I do think there was a bit of a high risk, high reward thing that would go on here, but you really cannot go simple with this matchup. The extravagance and the tone need to be present at all times, or else the whole thing is going to suffer for it. And there are a lot of interesting things to discuss in terms of the lore and the descriptions of these characters, which leads to some ambiguity in the debate, so naturally there's a lot of disagreements, but I just really want to see what Death Battle has to say about it. Sometimes that's a really big appeal, because there's going to be disagreements no matter what. I want to hear what Death Battle has to say, and yeah, that combined with the production value, or hopefully what the production value would be, I think that can make for a really interesting time. After that, we have Rayman versus Klonoa, Ubisoft versus Bandai Namco. This is something that's going to get some people typing in the comments right away, because there are many different opponents for Rayman, and some people have very strong opinions on who he should fight. I don't really have a preferred opponent for him outright, but I would be interested in seeing him show up. And at this point, I have to imagine that people's preferred opponent for him largely comes down to the characters that they're more familiar with, or the dynamic that they would most want to see, because if there was a definitive best opponent for him, I think we would be hearing those discussions a lot more definitively. And Klonoa does have some other options too, like Knights I've heard a few times, but I think it's hard to argue that this is an unworkable matchup for both of these characters, even if you do have another preferred. This is certainly appropriate stylistically and thematically. I have heard some conflicting things on the debate based on like interpretations of feats, etc., and I have to admit that is a little annoying. I personally prefer debates where it's more about how do the advantages play off of each other, rather than if you interpret it this way, this character definitely wins, if you interpret it this way, this character definitely wins, etc. But you know, it's fine. Some matchups are just gonna be like that. But ultimately, I think this is a matchup where the style really needs to be done well for it to work. The imagery is what makes it stand out, some would argue, and meshing the game styles together could make for a really cool production. I think we could use more cartoon-like video game characters. If this is how we get it, then I don't think I could complain too much. I think it's perfectly acceptable. I'm not going to deny that there are other options out there, and if other options happen with either of these characters, that would be fine with me too, as long as it's nothing horrendous. But yeah, I think this is a perfectly acceptable idea. I don't have any problems with it. But now we get to what used to be one of my most wanted episodes of all time, Bowser versus Eggman, Super Mario versus Sonic the Hedgehog. We all know it got confirmed. It's probably going to happen sometime later this year, and you've heard me talk about this one before, definitely, if you've been around this channel before, but I'm going to use this time to fanboy about it, since I really couldn't in my last video where I talked about the Kickstarter reveals. So yeah, here we go. I'm so freaking excited that this one is happening. I love quite literally everything about this matchup. In terms of the characters in the series, I love them. Bowser may or may not be my favorite Mario character. You know, it's a toss-up. It's kind of hard for me to tell. And I love Eggman as a character, and especially the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. Although I have a lot of nostalgia for both of the series, I really just love them. And I love the powers and the technology, all the abilities and how they would play off of each other. I love the personalities and how they would play off of each other. The army dynamic, the fight dynamic in general, etc. And I also really love the debatability of the win cons and specific outcomes, because I think a fight is a lot more interesting when both characters have very viable win cons. Having a win con is not enough to win the episode. You need to have better win cons than the other opponent, and fights where that is what is debatable is really interesting to me. Those are seriously some of my favorite kinds of fights ever. So I hope you guys can believe me when I say that I do have legitimate reasons for wanting my most wanted death battles of all time, but there is still some bias that can slip in here and there, and that definitely applies to this matchup, mainly because I love Mario versus Sonic as a matchup for very similar reasons that I love Bowser versus Eggman. It's very special to me, and I kind of want to be able to say that I got to experience my own Mario versus Sonic as I was deeply ingrained in this community. I don't really count the second Mario vs. Sonic because it is just a remake, but for the first Mario vs. Sonic, that came out well before I even knew what Death Battle was, and it kind of bummed me out that I didn't get to experience the release of it for myself. So especially with this level of production value the show has today, you know, I would love to get that with Bowser vs. Eggman. But yeah, the work in progress looked great that we saw from the tease. I am unbelievably excited for it. Simone vs. Kyle was also one of my most wanted, and that's also happening, but I already talked about about that in an earlier episode of this series. I think actually the first episode if you're interested. I may need to update my top 10 most wanted death battles again. This is just going by so fast. Next up, we have DanTDM versus Stampylonghead on YouTube. Now, I know I've said this somewhere on the channel before, but I'm personally not a huge fan of YouTuber fights on Death Battle. But before you guys start raging, because I know someone is going to get this wrong, this does not mean that I don't think they can work. It doesn't even necessarily mean I don't think they should happen. It's just not the kind of thing that appeals to me, you know? Like, I wouldn't be excited if I saw that a YouTuber fight was announced for an upcoming Death Battle. It's just that kind of thing. And this probably stems from the fact that I don't really watch that many individual YouTubers anymore. I definitely don't think I've watched much of these guys, but I know they each have a big following. I'm sure they deserve all the respect that they are getting. You know, kudos to them for building up a career on the internet, all that stuff. You know, great for them. I have to imagine that there would be some specific challenges with any YouTuber fight, like how it would work and what specific mechanics would be employed. Like, I know some YouTubers have, quote, sub-armies or something like that, and I'm sure that could be factored into some YouTuber debates, but then there's also like some specific lore that can just pop up throughout whatever kind of content the YouTubers make, and I'm sure some people could go through all of the videos and try to find every scrap of lore that you can get on the, quote, fictitious versions of these people, you know, for lack of a better phrase, so I'm sure it could work. It just sounds like a big hassle, and definitely not all YouTuber fights can be handled in the same way. I also just have no idea how willing Death Battle would be to do this. I think at least one person has spoken out against using YouTube before, but I might be wrong, and even if I'm not wrong, I might be missing some context, or it could be for whatever reason, so take that with a grain of salt. But yeah, overall, I can't really review the matchup specifically because I'm not familiar enough with the contents of the matchup, so I'll just leave it at that. If you like it, then more power to you, but this is never the kind of thing that I'll personally be itching for. I hope you can respect that. Moving on down the line, Homer Simpson versus Peter Griffin, The Simpsons versus Family Guy. This is yet another one of those matchups that everybody talks about, myself included in the past, and I don't really think I need to go into too much detail explaining why people want this matchup or why it works so well. These are just two crazy, sometimes unhinged shows that can make this cartoon episode truly its own, like stand out from the rest entirely. And full disclosure, these aren't even my two favorite adult cartoon shows. Like, if I were to try to pick a matchup that just included two of my favorite shows of that genre, I suppose, maybe I would go like Bob Belcher versus Hank Hill. I just really like King of the Hill, to be honest. But even with that, I can't deny that these are the perfect shows for a death battle format, despite being, quote, regular people, you know what I mean? And these shows have been going on for so long, especially The Simpsons. You know, they have such insane histories and inside jokes and memes that can fuel great analysis and animation moments. Just make it fun from start to finish. And I have heard this particular complaint over and over and over, but I really don't think that their crossover special should stop this episode from happening. Yes, it technically was canon, but it definitely didn't include all of the right conditions that a death battle would, and wasn't taken nearly as seriously. Like, writers make their own cartoon characters inconsistent almost on purpose. They use it to their advantage if they need to make specific things happen, such as two characters ultimately tying in a fight scenario. So it's really easy to just say that one or both of the characters weren't at top condition during that time, and just look at the other stuff that maybe wasn't on display in that fight, or stuff that they've acquired since that fight, etc., and just use that to determine who wins. Like, I really think it is that simple. And even aside from that, this is just one of those quintessential cartoon fights, dare I say an inevitable fight. In my opinion, you really can't cover big versus debates without doing this one, and thankfully it has loads of potential to go with it. I don't really know what else to say about it. It's just a good matchup. And finally, we have Goose versus Bread, Untitled Goose Game versus I Am Bread. Unfortunately, this is another one that I can't talk about too specifically because of my unfamiliarity. I've seen a few Let's Plays of I Am Bread, but that is it, and I know absolutely nothing about Untitled Goose Game. I am so sorry if that is your favorite game in the world. I'm just not that familiar. But if you really want me to say something about this matchup, I actually don't know if this is much more than a normal goose versus a normal piece of bread debate-wise. Like, I have no idea. Is the bread supposed to be more durable than a regular piece of bread or something like that? It's obviously more mobile. Like, it would honestly be funnier and better if it's not that. It would be more interesting, because if it really is just what you would expect from a goose versus versus a piece of bread, well, that's kind of lame if you ask me. But even aside from all of that, just based on what I know about this matchup, I'm having a hard time seeing how this would actually come together as a legitimate death battle production. Like, maybe I'm completely missing the mark here, but it feels as if Death Battle would have to have the characters doing stuff that they don't normally do in order to make it an actual entertaining animation. Like, I think back to Goomba vs. Koopa 2, where the characters were doing things that we've never seen them do before. It was absolute insanity, but Death Battle was able to take some liberties with it because it was just a DBX, and it was kind of like a jokey follow-up to one of their first episodes of Death Battle ever. It was excusable, and it ended up being really, really fun. But for something like Death Battle, where, you're supposed to take things a little more seriously and portray the characters really, really accurately, I don't think you can take two characters that don't fight so good and just immediately have them fighting really well just because you want to see these two characters in a versus show. And again, I feel like this is so obvious to say, but, I don't want to gatekeep with this one, because if you really like it, that's great. And Death Battle is unpredictable. We never know what they're going to do. But all I'm saying is that if it does happen, Death Battle better find a way to make it good. And what I really mean by that is Death Battle better make sure they can make it good before they start making it, as opposed to them starting to make it and then being like, ah, crap, we don't really know what to do, okay? It needs to be able to work in order for it to happen, not the other way around. And on that note, we have finished this batch of ideas. Leave your own thoughts about any of them in the comments below, and thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this. If you're looking to help participate in these, again, the best thing to do is read the description of this video to find out how, and keep close watch of my community posts. Hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.